The Maratha reservation protests have picked up pace once again, and this is at least sixth time that the reservation debate or the protests have become so intense across the state. Of course, not on all of these 6 or 7 occasions have the protesters made it to Mumbai, but as you can very clearly see around me, we are standing outside the CSMT, and this is the area which is considered to be the identity of Mumbai, right? When you talk about this circle where there is CSMT on one side, where there is the BMC building on the other hand, whenever one thinks of Mumbai, it is this place that comes into, in one's picture, and one can see that this entire place is filled with saffron flags, and thousands of people have been thronging in to this place, to the southern part of Mumbai from across the state. Now, more importantly, what we need to understand is where did this entire protest, debate or agitation start from? Did it start from 2023 when Eknath Shinde met Jarange Patil in Navi Mumbai and promised him with the documentation of Sage Soire? Or did it start in 2016 when the Marathi Mukh Morcha picked up pace and took over the entire state? When we talk about chronology, we need to understand that this debate at its very fundamental core began in the year 1978. Across the decade of 1960s and 70s, the issue of farmers became very important and very striking across the state, right? And that's why the Maratha community, a majority of whom are farmers, became the victims of the farmers' distress that we keep talking about, especially in Maharashtra. In 1978, one of the first of its kind full-fledged protest for the demand of reservation or special status to Marathas began under the leadership of Anna Sahib Patil. The agitation went on in different parts of the state up until 1982 when a very serious incident happened. When Anna Sahib Patil thought that his demands were reaching on deaf ears, he attempted to kill himself and died of suicide. Now that gave a new lease of life to the entire protest, and then that became the entire matter, which was still quite limited to certain pockets of Maharashtra, soon became a pan-Maharashtra issue. All the hopes were from the Mandal Commission, which was creating a report on deciding which communities to include in OBCs and which not. And the Mandal Commission was very clear in the year 1990 that Marathas are not socially or economically backward, and hence they will not be included in the OBC category. Now that again led to a flurry of reactions and massive amount of protests across the state. Now when you talk about Maratha community, I will continue the chronology in a short while, but let us try and understand what is the social positioning of the Maratha community. In all our history textbooks, we're all aware of Marathas being the dominant and the ruling class here in Maharashtra for the longest possible time. What is also important to understand is that Maratha community is the single largest community in Maharashtra. Marathas themselves constitute close to 32 to 33% of the entire state's population, which is a massive number. And while some might actually be socially and economically progressive or might have been so for longest possible time, the same cannot be applied to the entirety of the community, and that is exactly what, that was the argument that was held up by the pro-reservation activists, something that Manoj Jarange, who's sitting in Azad Maidan as we speak right now, is also reiterating upon. When we talk about Maratha community, as I said earlier, majority of them are farmers. The very core of Maratha community is in farming profession. And a lot of them are from Marathwada and Vidarbha. These are the two places or regions in the country, in the state, which are not necessarily known for being very farmer friendly. So when we talk about Marathas mostly being farmers and them being mostly concentrated in those areas which are not naturally most farmer friendly, the demand, sounds quite reasonable, is what the pro-reservation activists held on to in their political and social conversation with the status quo. Now coming back to the chronology, things politically stayed silent for the longest possible time, although there were agitations, again, as I said earlier, in different pockets of the state, up until the late 2000s. In 2009, the then NCP Congress government, did pass or did promise reservation for Marathas, and very interestingly, similar type of trend or similar type of pattern was followed in 2009, as I stated earlier, 2013, 2014, 2018, 2019, and 23-24. Now these dates or these years become very important because these are the years when the state goes to the poll. Maharashtra went to poll in 2009, 2014, 2019, and in 2024. And hence it became very clear that the status quo was very interested in making sure that the political mileage is driven towards vote getting capability of the Marathas rather than there been a long-term feasible solution in place. In 2016, the entire debate or the entire protest took a little sharp turn. As I mentioned earlier, in 2016 also becomes a very important point because Maratha Mukh Morcha took place across the state and it also reached Mumbai, very much at the place where I'm standing at the moment. The demands were plenty, primary one being that the Marathas should be given reservation. Back then, there was not a lot of clarity on whether the reservation is to be from within the OBC community or a separate reservation as a whole. And of course, there were other few provisions as well, which included the dilution of the SC/ST Act. When you talk about the atrocities, especially when the Marathas are involved in this entire case. Now, in 2018, when Devendra Fadnavis was the Home Minister and the Chief Minister of Maharashtra, SEBC reservation was guaranteed. 16% social and economically backward class reservation was guaranteed to Marathas, and that led to celebration across the state yet again. But in 2021, the Supreme Court struck down this particular provision by Maharashtra government on two grounds. Number one, it kind of overpowered or it went over the 50% ceiling that we often talk about when we talk about reservations, not just in case of Marathas, but Jats, Patidar, etc. 50% ceiling becomes very important, right? And secondly, because it was a direct violation, according to the judiciary, of the 102 amendment, constitutional amendment, and that is the reason why the 2018 SEBC reservation to Marathas, which was 16%, was struck down. Now, one thing became very clear to Maratha leaders by this time, because by 2021, reservation was promised on at least three occasions, 2009, 2013 and 2018, as I said earlier. One thing became very clear, that the government, whichever party is in power, is trying to give reservation which may not stand its ground in the judiciary. And that becomes very important because something like reservation needs to have more of a judicial backing, more than the executive backing, right? And it also became very clear to the protesters that the usage of the Maratha community to get political mileage is more than the genuine intent of the status quo, the government giving them the reservation. That is when a sharp turn took place in the demands of the Maratha protesters. By this time, Manoj Jarange had entered the fray, right? And in 2023, he started leading massive protests, mostly from Marathwada, Jalna and close by places. And on a couple of occasions, he also tried to make his way to Mumbai. In 2023, he was under the then Chief Minister Eknath Shinde. There was an attempt being made to stop Manoj Jarange at Vashi, where a Sage Soire certificate was given to Manoj Jarange, making it very clear that all those Marathas who will be able to prove their linkage with the Kunbis are considered to be long-distant Marathas who already fall under the OBC categories. Those Marathas will be able to prove their relation with Kunbis under the name of Sage Soire, which is a Marathi term, will get the reservation. While there were celebrations yet again, the protests still continued because then, as I said earlier, a sharp turn had already taken place where the Marathas now did not want a special reservation or an increased or a separate reservation. What they wanted was inclusion of Marathas in the 27% quota, which is for the OBC community. And that is where things become very tricky because the OBC community here in Maharashtra has close to 300 castes, which the OBC communities claim that is already a very cluttered space, right? 27% is nothing for them. And then if you add on another 30 to 33% of Marathas into that, things only become harder, is what the OBC leaders who were speaking against the Maratha reservation said. And the very basis of the reservation demand at the moment is that Manoj Jarange has time and again reiterated that they do not want separate reservation because they are aware of the fact that as what happened in 2021, it will not stand judicial basis. So they want the inclusion of Marathas in the OBC category. But at the same time, there are parallel agitations taking place in places like Nagpur. In fact, it started just today, where the OBC community is speaking very strongly against the inclusion of Marathas for the reasons that I elaborated on earlier, where they say that the space will become more cluttered. Now, what is the government doing about this? Only today morning, as we speak, a delegation, led by the Divisional Secretary of the Maharashtra government and a former judicial representative, Justice Shinde, is on its way to meet Manoj Jarange, where they will try and convince him on taking back the cases that have been put on the Maratha protesters, unless they are extremely serious. But we do not yet know whether the government is completely affirmative in providing or including Marathas under the 27% quota, which is meant for OBCs only. Because if that happens, then it will start a different debate and conversation pretty much nationally altogether. With camera person Praveen Shirohit, this is Anuj reporting for NDTV from Mumbai.